You can ride dinosaurs and shoot guns in this one. Awesome! Said some random Xbox employee. Survivors, the ARK 2 hype continued on day 2 of 2023, this time from Xbox themselves hyping up their upcoming games for this year. This has ignited a lot of discussion in the community about how primitive ARK 2 is actually going to be, and whether this tweet signals the signs of guns being in ARK 2, or whether it's just an Xbox employee posting without any knowledge of the game. So it did make me wonder what the developers actually meant when they said, "So what's next? Not tech, that's for sure," as we look forward to a primarily primitive themed ARK 2. And I'm very interested to know what you all think and what you all want in terms of progression in ARK 2. Does primarily primitive simply mean no tech, or does it mean primitive compared to the real world? What are you all hoping for? When I think primitive in terms of weapons, I automatically think of weapons that are made by hand, without machinery used to fabricate them. So I'm talking spears, bows and arrows, crossbows, knives, daggers, shields and likely small pistols. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I hear the word primitive. And when we look at the trailer back in December 2020, there are only very primitive weapons and combat involved. Now, I don't think we should be taking Xbox's tweet as any sign of confirmation that guns are involved, as we have no idea who is behind that account. But the thought occurred to me that what if Wildcard considers all the tiers in ARK 1 below tech as being primitive, and therefore their primarily primitive term could indicate content similar to ARK but with hardly any tech involvement. Now, primitive is a very curious term. If you think about it, spears are primitive to guns, and guns are primitive to tech. So surely it comes down to what Wildcard are referring to being removed when they say primarily primitive, and whether they mean primitive in terms of real world progression. There's been a lot of valid points raised in the community, and this has been really good to see some of the conversation. Some people want purely primitive. They essentially want what they hoped for in Primitive Plus, which sadly got abandoned and long forgotten, and that was very disappointing for a lot of players. But some raised some very valid concerns about progression and endgame content in ARK 2, and how that would even work if technology like guns didn't exist. And to me, it makes much more sense that some guns will exist in ARK 2 at some point, but it's very possible that the game progression is going to be stretched out a lot longer than it was in ARK 1 to keep it primarily primitive, even potentially to the point where less so primitive content could be introduced in future DLCs, similar to how tech was introduced in ARK 1. But let's not have another Scorched Earth DLC during early access controversy, please, Studio Wildcard. I'd personally like to see guns introduced in ARK 2, but at a much later stage. I want the early access release to be very primitive and hope for a lot of challenges that can't be solved by simply firing guns all over the place. I'm also hoping to have a much more variety of weapons and tiers of weapons too. Let's also not forget players are going to be able to uniquely customize their own weapons. And maybe it's something like this that will help keep the game primarily primitive, but not to the point people will get bored of the progression. I honestly think people are going to really enjoy customizing their weapons. This is something that I'm really looking forward to seeing how Wildcard have done this. People need to have something to push for in regards to endgame content and to keep people playing the game, and this I agree with, but it does create a bit of a conundrum. If ARK 1 had not introduced tech, it would likely have lost a lot of players through boredom or the fact that they progressed as far as they can in the game. But on the other hand, tech turned a lot of people away from the game. So if being primarily primitive means no guns at all, then is that healthy for the longevity of the game? Then there's the combat system for ARK 2, which has been a very controversial topic in the community, where the developers have said, with a focus on primitive era combat, Santiago and Tech have a complicated relationship. ARK 2 draws heavily from Souls-like action for its human scale combat, and emphasis on dodges, blocks, light and heavy attacks, combos and player reflex skill, a rarity for the PvP survival genre. Now, guns in a Souls-like game I believe is pretty rare, I could be wrong, but there are a number of games that do include guns where the combat is similar to what ARK 2 is described to be. So I wouldn't rule out guns based on the fact ARK 2 has Souls-like combat. And also, not to mention, I'm sure that the fantastic modding community will introduce guns if they don't exist at some point. But you know what might tell us how primitive it's going to be? That elusive gameplay trailer. Come on Wildcard, release it already. That is what the community is waiting to see. So let me know in the comments what you think the devs mean by primarily primitive, and how primitive or not so primitive you want ARK to be. Survivors, make sure to subscribe to keep up with all the ARK news. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.